Thank you, Dr. Plakius, for your insights on food trends in Ohio and the United States. We appreciate your expertise. Our final topic today will be the 2020 Commodity Outlook provided by Ben Brown. As mentioned earlier, Ben provides regular updates in the area of commodity market analysis. If you would like to receive updates from Ben or from the department, please visit our website at aede.osu.edu and click subscribe down at the bottom. With that being said, Ben Brown.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys. So we're excited to study the economics of agriculture, right? Yes? Well, that was really lame, people. Thank you, Dr. Plakius. Appreciate it. So I love this presentation. What I'm going to do, I hope to continue to give the Outlook presentation as long as they will allow me to do it. It's one of my favorites. I do enjoy doing this presentation every year. So we're going to talk a little bit about where I see markets going in the next year as we head into 2020, give you a little bit of maybe just kind of some demand outlook along with maybe some potential acreage allotments as we look at corn and soybean here in Ohio and across the country. As I mentioned earlier, I love to use pictures from Ohio, around Ohio. So if you have pictures, feel free to send them to me at any time. I always give credit. This one came from Zach Profit up in Northwest Ohio, a grain bin facility on their family farm, and I really appreciate them allowing me to use it. So I want to start with, and this is something that Alan Lyons and I talked about a year ago, and my good friend Alan Lyons, he basically said something at one time about how it's nice to go back and look and see how you did a year later. And so I have started doing this for my Outlook presentations. And so what I have done is I have taken the very last slide from my Outlook presentation exactly 1 year ago. I didn't change anything to it except for add a couple of little icons, which you'll see here in just a second. But the first thing I left you all with a year ago was that I thought we'd continue to have large supplies and lower use will continue to weigh on corn and soybean prices as we move forward in 2019. The changing prices would influence consumers and producers around the world, here in the United States, and then in places like Argentina and Brazil, China being another big one. Corn use for ethanol, even though at the time we were excited about E15 expansion and the possibility of E15 coming in for the summer driving season, I continued to see softness. And at that point, I talked about ethanol profitability at ethanol plants around the country, and I saw softness there. And then a stronger South American crop in 2019 that would hurt U.S. exports. Now, in this case, stronger is a relative term. Keep in mind that we were talking about the 2017-2018 Brazilian and Argentina crop that was suffering from an extreme drought. And so any increase above just extreme drought last year was going to be a stronger South American crop. And so, that was my first thing I said. Did I do okay? Yeah. How many would say yes? Yes, maybe. Okay, I would give myself a green check mark as well. This is my emblem that I added, okay? The second bullet point I left you with is grain marketing. Grain elevator forward contract bids suggest that there could be improvement for basis for both corn and soybeans. We were dealing with extremely low corn and soybean basis. If you remember, soybeans in Ohio was somewhere around 70 cents below. We were also looking at negative 60, 55 cent basis for corn. Now, those both came up, and I got helped a little bit with the prevent plant issue in Ohio in 2019. We saw a $1 shift in basis within a period of about 3 months on the corn side. But, that's what I said related to basis. Yes or no? Yes? Yes? All right. Yes, I would give myself a green check mark there, too. I promise you, I'm not this good. This is the third point, okay? Stronger premiums in spring and early summer 2019 than next summer. So basically, I was saying that the prices we were seeing heading into the winter months, especially on the soybean balance sheet. If you remember back, for those of you that were here last year, I made the case that our soybean stocks were extremely high, and the prices we were charging for soybeans, given our soybean stocks, did not make sense to me. And at the time, I told you that storing corn looked more profitable than soybeans. And I got several emails back that day asking about how that's calculated with interest expense and carry and basis. But that's what I said in relation to prices and futures prices. Yes, no, maybe, yes, yes. And Dr. Zuloff's shaking his head, so I'm going to take that as a yes. However, my fourth bullet point was market facilitation payments. Ark County soybean payments and FSA loans will help with cash flow in the winter. The winter being the winter of 2018-19, and not to expect those same cash flows and payments in 2019-2020. Yeah, red X. So overall, I thought I did pretty good. Dr. Sheldon, you're a mentor of mine. What would you give me grade-wise if I was in your class? An A minus. I'll take that. Yes. That's right, right. That was the positive thing, right? And, maybe yes. Okay, understandable. So let's talk about 2019. So let's get into 2019, and I want to relay back to my good friend Forrest Gump. You have all seen Forrest Gump. I ran across this. I can't think of a picture. They say a picture expresses 1,000 words. I think this pretty much sums up what we went through in 2019. One day it started raining in October, and it didn't stop raining until almost July 1st, right? I mean, that's pretty much what happened. And if we look at our prices, and this is just the cash corn futures contract for December corn futures. So this is new crop as we head through the marketing year, pretty flat. This is cash prices pretty flat. Even when we were starting to get into June, May, where's my clicker? This period right here, we started to see decreasing prices, but then you can see pretty clearly what started to happen this summer. And again, this was that pre-tariff trading era there in 2017. We saw decreasing as we started to see large U.S. crop, post-tariff prices, those cross-commodity effects between soybeans moving into corn acres or soybean acres that were moving into corn acres as relates to relative prices. And then obviously the chaotic that was the 2019 planting season. And this is where we started to have dreams of $6 corn. Corn was gonna go to the moon. We're all gonna get rich, at least if we could get a crop in the ground. And that's where we saw. And then you'll notice right here, there's a big drop, a big line. That represents June 28th. It's a day that stands out very much in my mind. I mentioned it earlier. Is Cheryl Turner still here? Did she leave? She must have left. She knew I was going to pick on her. Let me just say first and foremost, the National Ag Statistics Service is the envy of the world. Okay, USDA does an extremely good job of getting us information. It's the envy of the world. Now you could look at me and say, okay, well maybe they're the envy of the world, but are they always accurate? They do a pretty good job. And I think you'd find out that NASS is more right than they are wrong. And when they came out with 90 million acres there on June 28th, there was a lot of people that were like, how could this be? And we are seeing that play out as we move through the growing season. So this is Ohio's planting season, both for corn and soybeans. Corn on your far left, soybeans on the right. This is the planting window. The red dashed line is 2019. And so you can see for corn that this was the slowest planting season we'd had on record, all the way back to 1979. For soybeans, it was slow. It was very slow, but it wasn't the slowest. In fact, we had a couple other years that were comparable, mostly 1981 and 1989. And so what this did is this is what largely created that confusion and all that anger. I'm going to say anger because it really kind of was anger at USDA in terms of how could these acreage values be right. And so what I've got here is that first gray bar that you see there is the March intention survey. That's the survey that goes out to producers asking them what they're going to plant, whether that's corn or soybeans, how many acres. They do that in March. Now you cannot compare the March intention survey to the June intention or the planting survey, right? You cannot compare those two because there's a lot of things that happen in here in the middle. And this year in 2019, what we saw is soybean prices really started to tank in April. Right? We saw the drastic decline in soybean prices in April, and I think that moved some soybean acres over into the corn market. So you cannot look at that March survey number and say, okay, 91 million acres of corn was our base. It's possible that our base could have increased by June. But when that June planting report came out here, the red lines represent where we were this year, comparable to the black lines. The black lines representing our historical planting window as a country. And I give NASS a lot of credit. And this is where I wish Cheryl Turner was here so she could hear me give NASS a lot of credit. They did their job. They took the survey. They took the surveys back from producers. They reported the number that was in the survey, but they recognized that there was about 30 million acres still to be planted out there in the month of June. And so what they did is they announced a resurvey in July, basically going back and asking what actually happened to those acres. And they went out and they resurveyed, and then we got the new acreage numbers on August 12th. a day I remember quite well as well, because again, we did not believe the numbers as we move forward. So as we moved into harvest, let's transition into harvest a little bit. Even though we had the slowest corn planting on record and a comparable slow planting of soybeans, but not the slowest, our harvest has actually been somewhat slow, but pretty much in the middle. And you see that red line both for corn and soybeans, kind of right in the middle of where our historical plantings or our harvest windows for Ohio have been. Now, granted, we're harvesting less. We have less acres to harvest, but we're right there in the middle of that. And so it's slow, but it's not delayed. However, this will have effects when we start talking about yield and maybe some of our potential on harvested acreage numbers, which I want to go into real quick. One of the things that happened this year is, as a country, we were naturally delayed in terms of crop maturity, not just here in Ohio, but in other parts of the country, South Dakota being a big one. But North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota have a large portion of corn and soybean acres. They're large producers, especially South Dakota on soybeans, North Dakota on soybeans, and Minnesota on corn. And so what you see there on the left is the NOAA radar of this winter blast. Do you remember this going across the news? It even made it to DC. They were talking about it on DC news channels about this winter blast. It was working its way across the country. It was going to hit the Greater Plains, North Dakota, Minnesota, and South Dakota. And what we saw there was that we had a ton of corn that wasn't mature yet. And we had a bunch of soybeans that hadn't reached pod fill. And so the question was, is this going to end? Is this going to kill the maturity of these plants? Are we going to lose acreage in some of these states where we see big acreage and production of corn and soybeans? And so USDA announced a resurvey. So they resurveyed growers in Minnesota and North Dakota and South Dakota, and then reported that in their November 8th report. They did not find any deviation in harvested acres, which I find interesting based on this slide. And these are 3 pictures sent from friends of mine in North Dakota. That's corn flattened by snow. That is soybeans flattened by snow and wind. And what you see in the picture there is the amount of acreage and the percent mature or pod fill, or soybeans dropping leaves, for the 3 states. And what you end up with is, at least on the corn side, is you end up with 7 million acres of corn in those 3 states alone that were not at maturity when this storm hit. So I find it interesting that we did a resurvey, we looked at harvested acres, and we didn't make an adjustment. That tells me that we're probably going to see some changes on yield on the backside as we come through and we work our way through this harvest season. So that's the first thing related to harvested acres. The second thing is how we categorize cover crops. Now I'm going to split the top for just a second. The Farm Service Agency reports cover crops based on, did you plant a cover crop on this acre? Yes or no? Was it a legume or was it a grass? They don't ask you if it was corn, if it was soybeans, if it was rye, if it was Sudan grass. They just ask you, did you plant a cover crop or not? The National Ag Statistics Service does include prevent plant acres. They also don't break it out, but they include if a prevent plant acre is corn, for instance. So if you planted, or excuse me, not prevent plant, if a cover crop is corn, meaning that I had some extra corn seed or soybean seed, so I put that on a prevent plant acre, I counted that as a cover crop acre. NASS counts that as a planted corn acre, okay? It's a difference, right? But that acre will never be harvested for grain. So therefore, should it really be counted as a corn acre? That difference is gonna show up in that harvested number, or the difference between what got planted and what eventually gets harvested. And I'll show that point graphically here in just a second, but I want to point you down to the bottom. So for the last 3 years, we've had roughly about 2 million acres of cover crops in the United States, planted across all acres. As of the latest report on November 8th, we were at 5.2 million acres of cover crops. Now there is several acres of corn and soybeans. We don't know how much because, again, FSA doesn't ask, is it a corn acre, is it a soybean acre? They just ask, did you plant a cover crop or not? But there is a question about how many acres of that 5.2 will be taken out of the planted or the harvested acreage number on the corn balance sheet. So if we look at harvested acres compared to planted acres, and this is, I think, a very real possibility moving forward, is I do think NASS got the planted acreage number correct. I think 90 million acres of corn is a pretty realistic corn acreage number. However, I have maybe some concerns, and we'd like to point out and talk about the difference between planted and harvested. Now, the harvested acreage is what gets harvested for grain. So the difference there, that 8 million acre gap, includes silage, because silage is a corn acre that was planted but never harvested for grain. So it gets taken out. And so we've consistently averaged about 8 million acres between abandonment and then silage acres. The fact that we're still at 8 million acres of a gap between planted and harvested makes me a little cautious, right? I'm cautious of that harvested number, that we wouldn't eventually start to see that come down. And if we don't start to see that come down, I think we lose that corn on the yield side. So no matter if you take it out of the harvested side or if you take it out of the yield side, I do think there is some potential to reduce production moving forward. And so if we look at yield, again, this was just a change in yield, and you see that Ohio's sitting there at 163, significantly down from last year, our record of 188. Keep in mind, last year, a 188 yield on corn was 8 bushels higher than our previous record. The fact that we went 8 bushels above our previous record last year just signifies how good of a year it was in Ohio, following it up with 163. In historical terms, that 163 is actually not that bad of a yield. I mean, that's not too far off from what we had seen, not that long ago. It's just that we're looking at it in the lens of 2018, where we saw really good yields. But Indiana and Ohio both saw increases in the last update. And so I like to look at this in terms of colors. And so basically, this is my way of graphically saying, do good crops get better and do bad crops get worse, right? And so this is color coded for the different changes or the different updates. You've got the September to August update in that first color column. You've got the October to September, or the September to October change in the second colored column. And then the third column is the change from October to November. And what you see there, oh, and by the way, these are all states ranked in order of their production. So Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Minnesota, Indiana, top 5 production states, right? So the fact that we didn't see any change in yield in Iowa and Illinois, given their large production values, signals to me that we were going to see a low change in yield for U.S. soybean or U.S. corn, and we did. We saw that 1% decline in the corn yield moving forward. But you see a slight increase to maybe modest changes in the top producing states. But where you see the real declines in terms of corn yield come down here in some of these smaller states like North Dakota, even though North Dakota is a big producing state as well, but Texas, Colorado, North Carolina, states that don't have as much acreage as what Iowa, Illinois does. So if we look at the soybean side, again, not a whole lot of change. Ohio coming in there at 48 bushels to the acre on the soybean side. Indiana right next door, seeing a little bit of an increase heading through this spell. But again, if we look at the color code maps here, and again, same type of scenario, I'm basically just asking you to look at the colors. If you can see green moving through the spectrum or across for the different states, that crop got better as we moved into harvest, or producers felt that their crop was a little bit better than what they thought. If it's starting to get red as you move through, that's producers signaling to NASS that they feel, or the objective yield survey showing that yields are getting worse. And again, at least on the soybean side, yields have actually been improving a little bit as we've moved through the growing season, looking at some of that late planted crop. So if we look at the demand side, again, this is old demand. So this is old crop, or the crop that we just harvested. Are harvesting right now. If we look at our demand, I've got a couple of marketing years out here on the back, but then here's the current marketing year right there, 1920. This is the marketing year we're in right now, and then the change from the previous marketing year. That should be 1819, not 1718, I'm sorry. But I want to point out a couple of things. First and foremost, we see the reduction in feed and residual use. This might be a little bit surprising given the amount of livestock we have in the country and the amount of grain consuming animals we have in the country. But I want you to look at that 2018 number right there, and keep in mind this is a percent change from the previous year. That 5.6 largely resulted in us realizing that we didn't have as much grain on hand at the end of the year last year as what we thought we should. There's 2 scenarios to that. One, we actually fed that much, and it shows up right there in the feed and residual number. Or 2, the 2018 crop wasn't as big as what we actually thought it was. And that's actually if I had to pick, and if somebody asked me, I would say that our crop in 2018 wasn't actually as big as what it was, because that's a pretty big livestock number comparable to what we've had. Now, we do have record grain consuming animal units, but that's a pretty big number, and I think that's going to set up some changes as we move forward. Ethanol continues to hang in there, roughly projected at the same as what it was last year, but down from the record in 2017, 2018 when we had and saw huge exports of ethanol to Brazil, Canada, even places like Mexico and Colombia. But then exports down here have been the real weakness and continue to be a disappointment as we move through this growing season, largely due to price competitiveness. South American crops, and I'll show you that here in just a second, are cheaper for buyers around the world than U.S. crops. A strong U.S. dollar is hurting our ability to compete on the world market. But then also just a very large South American crop. Brazil had a record crop at the end of last year following their drought the year before. They're expected to expand acreage 7% again this year. We're seeing places like Ukraine come on as a major supplier of corn to the world as well. And so that export number continues to lag. It's been very disappointing. This is the lowest amount of corn exports we've had since 2012 when we had a major drought. We were rationing corn use here in the United States. All this is to say is that we do shrink ending stocks a little bit, and we have a little bit of price support or price increases for the 2019-2020 marketing year. But overall, not as much of a change as maybe what we were expecting a couple of months ago. So again, I think that feed and residual use number is something that sticks out and maybe isn't as accurate, given that maybe part of it came off the supply, or was because the 2018 crop wasn't as large as what it was. If we look at those feed numbers, the big shock that we saw there at the end of September when they announced the grain stocks on hand for corn, and they announced the 2.1 billion bushels of corn on hand versus what people were expecting of 2.4. We had some strong price support. We saw corn prices jump 20 cents that day because it was a shock that most people weren't expecting, and it was largely due to this reason. This is animal feed in the fourth quarter. So June, July, and August. Those are the 3 months that are captured in the fourth quarter of corn marketing. And you can see where we've been the last couple of years, and then all of a sudden we jump up to over 1 billion bushels of corn use in that fourth quarter. Right? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, making me think that 2018 crop really wasn't as big as what it was, but USDA chose to stick it in the balance sheet in terms of feed use. Just something to keep in mind as we move forward, and I'll talk about animal consuming units here in just a second. In terms of corn exports, this is the last couple of marketing years. The black line that you see right there was the previous marketing year. You see the flat line right there where the government shutdown happened. We weren't recording exports of anything of corn, but you can see that we started out really strong on that drought in South America, and then just really tapered off throughout the growing season as South America came back on board and started reshipping corn to the rest of the world. And it really tapered off, and it's really kicked in and continued with us into 2019, 2020. This does not mean that we cannot export more corn as we move through the growing season, but a couple of things are going to happen. One, we're going to have the supply, which I think we do here in the United States to send corn. We're going to have to be price competitive. Buyers are responding to price signals. They recognize that Brazilian prices are cheaper for a corn source than what they are here in the United States. Plus, we're also seeing imports of Brazilian corn in the United States. Now, every once in a while, we do import corn into the United States, even though we're a major producer. It just doesn't really ever make headways, right, until you have low prices. And then it becomes a little sensitive for us corn farmers here in the Midwest. Why are chicken feeders and poultry feeders in the Southeast importing corn from South America? Well, logistically, it's cheaper for them. And that's due to currency exchanges and just logistic transportation. So if we look, these are freight on board prices of corn. And I know this is really small. So the top one up here, this is freight on board corn prices out of Brazil's Paranagua port. Right now it's coming out of Brazil at $4.18. That same corn coming out of the port of New Orleans here in the United States is coming out at $4.34. So let's see, what is that? 16, a 16 cent incentive over the Brazilian price. And we see our future commitments of corn for delivery at a future point down 47% at this time. Again, we can still make up for this, but we're going to have to see a couple of things change, or we're going to continue to see weak corn export demand moving forward. If we look at ethanol, and I didn't get to talk about my ethanol slide earlier, but we have continually seen a decline in the amount of corn used for ethanol or crushed for ethanol. Part of this is, I mean, there is some demand destruction maybe, or from ethanol waivers, but a big chunk of it is just profitability of ethanol plants being low. Price of ethanol is low. We've produced a lot of ethanol. If I was to go back here and show you my slides from earlier, the big change in terms of ethanol use, right? There's both supply and demand for corn and supply and demand for ethanol. The biggest change of supply and demand for ethanol has actually been the loss of export markets. We had huge ethanol exports in 2018. We've lost those. I was very excited last week to see that the U.S. sent a trade delegation to Mexico. Mexico is a market where I think we could send a lot more ethanol from the United States. I think China is also in the hunt for ethanol. If we could ever resolve any of our trade negotiations that Dr. Sheldon talked about earlier, they've got an Olympics coming up in 2020. They desperately want to improve air quality for the Olympics. They have policies geared to ethanol that they keep rolling back because they can't meet it themselves. I think they could import ethanol. If we ever do get a trade one day, and I'm not making any predictions because I just take policy as is at the moment, but I actually expect it to maybe include ethanol, maybe at a future time period, just based on the fact that they are interested in it. They want it for their market. India is another one that wants to increase air quality, and I think we can export. But my point here with ethanol, and I was trying to make it a little bit earlier, the future of our ethanol industry is in international markets, not necessarily our domestic market. As we continue, and we heard Dr. Sheldon talk today about the decline of oil use and reserves. Of course, we have a 10% blend here in the United States, but I think there are places around the globe, especially Mexico. Mexico would be ideal right across the border, that I think would be open and willing to using more U.S. ethanol. So if we look at basis, again, you can't really see the lines here, but you know, there's Chicago, so this is Ohio. Western Ohio and Eastern Indiana, so Sam, this is you guys, has the best and strongest corn basis in the United States. This is a lot to do with animal feeding availability, but then also we haven't seen grain move off farm into markets in Ohio like we've seen in other places around the country. Part of that is farmers mostly don't move grain off farm into the market unless they need cash. They're getting these MFP payments, and so they're keeping that grain hoping for a higher price. And so we haven't seen corn move as freely or as rapidly as what we've seen in other states across the country. So if I look at our corn demand outlook for old crop, I think there are some remaining acreage questions, especially on the harvested side, with both that winter storm in the Great Plains, but then also cover crop potential within our harvested acres currently that are being counted both as corn and as a cover crop. Demand, to be truthful, it's hard to find a believable bright spot in the demand picture for corn. I put believable in there from the standpoint that you could say that animal use is a bright spot, but I would argue that even that's not necessarily accurate, that it really should be a lower 2018 crop rather than an increase in animal feed in 2018. One of the bright spots is that Argentina just had an election. Their new president is very much in favor of export taxes. Maybe that'll help increase our ability to export corn onto the market, but I think we're going to continue to see relaxed exports of corn from the United States at least through February. I think corn use for ethanol will be slow until ethanol supply comes down. How do you get ethanol supply to come down to get that price back up? Well, you produce less ethanol. Or you export more. Our export markets, especially on the ethanol side, haven't been picking up, so we've been reducing the supply of ethanol. Right? That's why we've seen ethanol plants either tailor back or shut down in Ohio and other places around the country. They've reduced the supply of ethanol to help raise that price and become more profitable in the short run. So I guess the point that I have for producers related to corn demand is there is a possibility, I think, for a short window of higher corn prices. I would argue that our highest corn prices of this crop are already past us. They came on July 18th. If you still got corn to market, I think there will be a short window maybe for some reasonable prices in the next couple of months, maybe in January and February. But then I think we're going to see a tailored off and heading into the spring and summer, potentially similar to where we are right now with relaxed. If we look at the soybean demand side of the equation real quick, one thing I just want to point out real quick, there's our beginning stocks that we started the year with last year. Here's where we are this year. almost doubled them based on those lower export numbers. But look at now back where we are now, 460 million bushels. Again, that would be a relatively high amount of soybean stocks on hand. But considering we came down from almost a billion and over a billion bushels in June, it's really amazing, and we've added price back onto this mix. I was in Stark County, Ohio, which is up Canton area, kind of. Massillon is Stark County. Last year on February 15th, and I remember telling the Outlook crowd there at the time that if they wanted soybean prices at $9, they needed to plant 74 million acres of soybeans. And I asked them, how many of you are planning on reducing soybeans? And not a single hand went up. And I said, so we've got a little bit of a problem on the soybean side that we're not going to reduce acres. Prevent Plant helped us out a little bit with that. That got us down our soybean acreage back down to 76. I thought it would take 74. It only took 76, but we got a $9 soybean price for the current marketing year as well. So if we talk about soybean exports, and again, I've just got a couple more slides, but if I look at soybean balance sheet and demand going forward, it's still all about exports. It's the big wild card moving forward. Do we believe, these large shipments of soybeans to different places, to China? We've historically seen, basically what I've plotted out here is these red bars represent actual shipments of soybeans to the Chinese. The gray bars represent commitments. So as those gray bars start tapering off, you see those commitments turn into actual shipments. But at different points in the last year, we saw commitments of Chinese to buy US soybeans. We saw 5 million metric tons last year in November when they were all in Argentina, at a meeting, and President Trump and the President of Canada and Mexico signed the North America Free Trade Agreement. We saw another 5 million metric tons in January, and then a 10 million metric ton promise there in February. Those actually didn't become realistic or realized, I guess, until October of this year when China waived 10 million metric tons of tariffs. They basically said, we're not going to charge tariffs for our companies, our state-owned enterprises, as Dr. Sheldon said earlier. We went from a 27, 28% tariff all the way down to 3%, and voila, they started shipping again, right? So we know that Chinese buyers are willing to buy US soybeans if they're price competitive, right? And so if we look at the alternatives, and it's at the top, that's the US soybean, the Brazilian freight on board soybean price in Paranagua. Right now it's trading at 1038 or 1030, I guess. The US soybean price out of New Orleans is at 987. At least from a just straight monetary standpoint, US soybeans are price competitive. They're cheaper onto the world market. People are willing to buy US soybeans if there is no tariff. And so that's where we're seeing China relax some of these tariffs, say, hey, we're willing to give waivers to some of our state-owned enterprise companies to where they don't have to pay the tariff, and then we see them buy US soybeans. So markets do work. And our future commitments are just down 2% from a year ago, which is pretty good. And we've got a 40-cent premium or benefit compared to Brazilian soybeans at this time. If we add on that 3% tariff, it goes to 14%. But at a 28% tariff, we're still not competitive. So we need free markets to continue to ship soybeans to the Chinese market and boost our supply. We benefited greatly this last year from soybean exports to the European Union. This is a moving supply curve. Basically, right here's where tariffs went on place on US soybeans by the Chinese. We saw the drastic increase of soybean imports from the European Union. They started to taper off as we started to see them, I think, reach their full potential in terms of what they're able and what they need in terms of soybeans. They were buying a lot of cheap soybeans earlier just because they could buy cheap soybeans, and they were stockpiling them earlier. That's kind of relaxing now, and I don't look for those markets to be as big moving forward as what they were. Somebody earlier asked about African swine fever. I've got basically two slides, or one slide related to African swine fever. The purple bars over here represent the reduction in pork production in the Chinese market. And right now, there for a while, no one could really understand or gather how big of a decline in pork production due to African swine fever. Industry is now starting to come, and China has even announced somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 45% of a reduction in the pork supply. You can see what that does in terms of the total million metric tons of pork available. If you compare that, and just for perspective, because sometimes I think we forget how big of a pork supplier China is. or producer. These gray bars represent, the first bar is global trade of beef. So all countries in our trade of beef. The next column is our global trade of pork, and the next column is our global trade of chicken. So at a 40% reduction in pork in China, that is more than all three of those, maybe not added up together, but getting pretty close. Actually, two of them, not three, but two of them. And then over here, this third column, this is our US production of beef, poultry, and pork, right? So a reduction, a huge reduction in the Chinese market leads to big reductions in soybean demand. It's hard to put exactly a number, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 3% of total global soybean reduction due to African swine fever in China. So hopefully that answers the question from earlier, but I think it's about 3% of global soybean production. Again, I think there is possibilities for, and this is where maybe my economic talk for Ohio agriculture, I think there is possibilities for soybean meal in Ohio. If we look at the crush value, so a soybean product goes into a crush facility and out comes soybean oil and soybean meal. Both of those have price components with it. If the prices of those two components are above what you can pay for soybeans, that incentivizes soybean crush, and we see an increase in soybean crush. And right now that premium is 16% or 16.5%, saying that the crush value to crush soybeans into soybean meal and soybean oil is a 16% premium to just buying straight soybeans. So I think there is potential for soybean crush. However, we know that that industry grows at a very slow rate. However, lucky for us, and some of you might have saw this, Cargill announced an expansion of soybean crush in Lima, increasing jobs to the state. That's extremely beneficial to the state, and I think geographically relevant given the concentration of animal consuming units. White states are states that saw a decrease in total livestock units. Basically, we add all livestock together, make them comparable. Red states saw increases. There were 3 states that saw large increases: Washington State at 20%, Ohio at 13%, and Michigan at 22%. So those were 3 states that saw large increases in grain consuming animal units. I think having a soybean meal processing facility adds additional soybean demand in Ohio, helps our local basis. If we look at basis again, Western Ohio and Eastern Indiana tend to have the strongest basis across the country, largely due to, strongest basis across the country due to large presence of livestock, but also just that's where we saw major reduction in soybean acreage. And so if we look at the soybean demand outlook, I still think there's some downward division in the national soybean price or yield, even though they've been getting a little bit stronger here lately, mostly due to that storm in the northern plains. African swine fever seems to have stabilized at 40 to 45% of the breeding herd in China, leading to 11% decline in world soybean demand, 3% decline in world soybean production. So that's the difference I said earlier, 11% of soybean demand versus 3% of production. U.S. soybean meal is at capacity, but will increase year over year, given the incentives that I just talked about. A China deal, even if shallow, would be a big win for U.S. soybean, given, and I'm going to use big in quotes, it would allow us to be competitive with South America. Some of the dryness that they've had earlier in this growing season is pushing back their availability for soybeans later in the season in February, shrinking that second crop, corn crop. And so if we could get some type of shallow deal in the near future, I think that would be beneficial to soybean exports because we'd be price competitive in the Chinese market as we move forward. And then other soybean countries, some soybean importing countries seem to be reaching their max, mostly the European Union. Places like Egypt, the Netherlands, Taiwan seem to be backing off in the short term. So if we turn and look at the new crop and we talk about acreage, basically what I've got here is I've got the previous 9 years of acreage for corn, soybeans, hay, winter wheat, spring wheat, cotton, sorghum, canola, sunflowers, and rice. Obviously, all these are affected by relative prices of each, but we've seen a consistent 180 million acres, 176 to 180 million acres of corn and soybeans together. Given our demand picture of everything I just showed you on the old crop demand, I think 171 million acres together of corn and soybeans is what would get us to the prices we have today. Now, if we need 171 and we're used to planting 180, what does that mean? Oversupply, right? And we know that producers are slow to respond, slow to move production out. Part of the problem is we don't have anything right now to move production to. Probably the biggest thing would be moving it to pasture land and grazing some type of cattle, whether grazing dairy heifers or beef cattle. But that's a 2 to 3 year commitment. I'm not sure we're going to see that change. And so I do expect to see more acreage of corn and soybeans together than what we need. However, the acreage blend is a little bit uncertain. I tend to use this metric anytime the new price of soybeans, so the November 2020 contract, is 2.5 times the new corn price or the December futures corn price for 2020. We see higher soybean acres. If it's less than 2.25, meaning the soybean price is less than 2.25 above the corn price, we see corn acreage, which we did see that incentive back in April. Remember when I told you the soybean prices tanked off? But it's now come back up and it's split right down there in the middle. So if I take some of these things into account and I look at basis, I actually think we could see stronger soybean acreage heading into 2019 or 2020 than maybe what some are projecting. So I've been putting corn acreage somewhere in the ballpark of 93 million acres, soybean acres some in the neighborhood of 85 million acres, right? Somewhere in that ballpark, 85, 86. Again, those are higher than what we need for both crops, but do support policy. So this is my grade card. You can take a picture of this, bring it back next year and tell me how well I did. We'll do this all over again. We'll have a good time. But I think large stocks and supplies will grow in 2020, 2021. One, I think demand is weak in the current marketing year, and I think we're going to oversupply again. I hope we can come up with some type of use for corn and soybeans, but again, I do think that we're headed towards that period again of growing domestic stocks, whether that's individually owned stocks and bins and elevators across the country, or that's governments holding stock to support prices. But I think there's higher acreage in 2020 and large ending stocks, especially of corn on weaker demand. Corn exports will struggle at least until February. That's when I actually see Brazil starting to run out of corn is about February, if I'm doing the math correctly down there. The question then becomes, does Ukraine substitute in and take over some of that area that Brazil's giving up? Soybean demand looks to pick up from 2018, 2019. Again, this is a relative term. We had pretty low demand last year, so a little bit of an increase here. Soybean exports are the wild card. If we can get a shallow deal with China, I think that's positive for U.S. soybeans because we're competitive at tariff-free rates. Growth in domestic soybean crush will increase modestly, but I think we are seeing it in strategic locations around the country. Ohio, Indiana, Kansas, and Nebraska, for instance, is I think where we're going to see some of that soybean crush, which is good for producers here in Ohio and a good place for investment. However, African swine fever, I think, is a bigger issue than we all realize. I don't think we fully grasp the concept of it yet. We are seeing double-digit food inflation, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18, 16% food inflation in China, 100% inflation in the price of pork in China, signaling that they are really suffering from pork losses and looking for imports both from the United States and Canada, even though our pork's going into China is 70% tariff. And then grain marketing, once again, I think the best opportunity will come late spring or early summer, that March, April period. I guess that's not really early summer, but I guess I kind of treat it as it. Basis opportunities exist at the present, especially for the Eastern Corn Belt. I'm not a huge fan of basis contracts, just straight basis contracts, but this could be a year where those are wise. It could be a possible strategy, locking in a futures price at a later point in time. And then storing beans looks favorable to corn in reverse to storing corn over soybeans last year. Again, that's due to a possible increase in basis for soybeans over corn, and then the current carrying charges both for corn and soybeans as we move forward. So with that, that is my outlook. I welcome any questions anybody have. I thank you all for coming today. And does anybody have any questions for me? Yeah, Alan. I love Alan's questions. Mm-hmm.
I noticed you didn't discuss the substitution effect of other grains for corn in the livestock diet.
Yeah, probably wheat would probably be the biggest, especially out west. And I think we still don't have a good understanding of how widespread DDG use in feed is. I was talking to Cheryl Turner earlier, asking if NASA had ever considered updating a study that they did about 15 years ago, looking at some of the substitution and willingness to substitute products. But wheat would be the biggest one out west, especially given that we're seeing Russia come on as a major supplier of wheat, dropping world wheat price. We're seeing it especially in western Kansas, where you've got some feedlots, western Nebraska, western Kansas, where they can substitute wheat into feed rations. So, yep. I think it is a very big question, and it's something that until we figure out feed use, we will continue to miss those stocks reports. They'll continue to be shocks. Any other questions? Okay, cool. I've got some just closing remarks. First, thank you all very much for coming today. We really appreciate it. A couple of big thank yous. Kelly Chernosky, our communications director, and Janice DeCarolis did a lot of the work for this. And so we want to thank them. I don't think either one of them are in here today or right now, but definitely thank them. Yeah. I want to thank our moderator today, Bailey. Bailey's a junior in our department. We appreciate him coming today and being a part of this. So thank you, Bailey.